When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, not only were there smoking ruins, corpses, and ghost cities, there were also questions. But one in particular has haunted historians, treasure hunters, and intelligence services for decades. What happened to Adolf Hitler's fortune? For more than a decade, the Führer amassed wealth on a colossal scale. Propaganda, book sales, gifts from businessmen, looting of conquered territories. Money flowed in secret, hidden in accounts, vaults, tunnels, and perhaps in places where no one has yet looked. After his death in the Berlin bunker, that fortune did not disappear. It simply vanished. Was it confiscated? Did his close associates inherit it? Or does it still rest underground, waiting to be discovered? In this video, we will unravel one of the most disturbing enigmas of the post-war period. Get ready to follow the trail of Nazi gold, lost documents, and clues silenced for decades, because money does not disappear, it only changes hands, and sometimes it leaves a trail of shadows. What happened to Hitler's money after the Second World War? The enrichment of the Führer during the Second World War. While Europe burned in the flames of the Second World War, with cities reduced to rubble, families separated, and millions of lives cut short in the silent halls of German power, one man amassed wealth like a true hidden monarch. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Third Reich, presented himself to the world as a servant of the nation, austere, disciplined, immune to the temptations of luxury. But that carefully constructed public image was only a facade. In the intimacy of power, Hitler lived surrounded by luxuries, protected by a network of privileges, million-mark donations, and state resources placed entirely at his disposal. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, his personal finances were nothing remarkable. During his youth in Vienna, he had survived as best he could by selling hand-painted postcards, staying in public hostels, and eating in charity dining halls. His attempt to enter the Academy of Fine Arts failed, and his wandering life barely allowed him to survive. Even after his service as a soldier in the First World War, his economic situation continued to be precarious. Everything changed with the attempted coup d'etat in 1923, known as the Munich Putsch. Although it failed and ended with him in prison, that confinement marked a turning point. During his incarceration in Landsberg prison, he dictated to Rudolf Hess the fundamental lines of his ideology in a manuscript titled Mein Kampf. At first, the book had little impact and modest sales. But after the rise of Nazism to power, the text became an essential instrument of indoctrination and an unprecedented publishing phenomenon. From 1933 onward, the regime's propaganda machinery promoted its sale on a massive scale. The government bought it in large quantities to give away at all kinds of official events, weddings, military anniversaries, promotions of officials, and oaths of loyalty. It was customary to give a copy to each soldier or married couple. In practice, the state was subsidizing its author, and that author was the Führer. Between 1933 and 1945, Hitler earned more than 7 million Reichsmarks solely from Mein Kampf royalties, an astronomical sum for the time. Furthermore, to avoid sharing a single cent with the German tax authorities, he ordered that no personal taxes be charged to him. Hitler exempted himself from his tax obligations, a decision no other German citizen could make without consequences. It was a demonstration of the absolute power he enjoyed. The man who was the law was also above it. Consolidated as Führer, Hitler turned the resources of the German state into an extension of his personal patrimony. Official residences, domestic staff, means of transport, food, and even his uniforms were paid for by the Reich treasury. He lived like a modern emperor, without spending a single Reichsmark from his own pocket. His luxurious life unfolded in multiple settings. In the Reich Chancellery, a monumental building decorated with marble, classical art, and endless windows, Hitler lived and governed with an entourage that attended to his every whim. In his apartment on Prinzregentenplatz in Munich, he maintained a more sober but equally refined style with antique furniture, oriental rugs and Meissen porcelain, and above all in the Berghof, his alpine retreat in Obersalzberg, transformed with public funds into a luxurious mountain mansion. There he had terraces with panoramic views of the Alps, a private library, a personal cinema, diplomatic reception rooms, and bedrooms with high-end furnishings. In addition, he had an armored luxury train for his travels and a fleet of customized Mercedes-Benz vehicles, all paid for by the state or donated by accommodating manufacturers. His daily life, from meals to laundry, was financed by the public apparatus. But his wealth was not limited to what the state provided him. A fundamental part of his fortune came from the direct support of the German industrial elite, which saw in Nazism an opportunity to stop the advance of communism and recover the businesses lost after the crisis of '29 and the Treaty of Versailles. Companies such as IG Farben, the chemical giant that would later manufacture Zyklon B gas, Krupp, the powerful arms industry, Siemens, a leader in technology and infrastructure, Daimler-Benz, manufacturer of luxury and armored vehicles, not only financed the Nazi Party but also made personal donations to the Führer. These contributions were given in cash, goods, or resources in kind, and were often justified as voluntary contributions to the leadership. Many of these donations ended up in private accounts managed by his closest circle, especially by the party treasurer Franz Xaver Schwarz, who handled the so-called Führer's Honor Fund. This fund was not subject to any audit or accountability, and it served to pay for the luxuries of the circle of power closest to Hitler, from works in his residences to diplomatic gifts and private parties. The war was not only a military conflict, it was also a gigantic project of systematic looting. As the Nazi armies advanced through Europe, planned mechanisms were activated to expropriate central banks, museums, private homes, and art collections. Thousands of tons of gold, foreign currencies, bonds, jewels, and masterpieces were taken from Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and other occupied countries. Although much of this loot was channeled to the Reich treasury, an important part remained in private hands, among them Hitler's. The Führer himself had a personal obsession with classical European art, especially Renaissance and Flemish paintings. Much of what was stolen was destined for his private collection or stored for the future Führer museum he planned to build in Linz, Austria. In his megalomaniac vision, this museum would be the largest in the Western world, surpassing even the Louvre or the Prado. No less valuable were the jewels confiscated from Jewish families, the assets of expelled bankers, the properties seized from political exiles, and the frozen accounts of opponents. All that capital was redistributed among the Nazi leaders, used to finance secret operations, and part ended up under the direct control of Hitler and his circle of trust. A life built on hypocrisy, Hitler presented himself to the people as a sober man, celibate, without visible vices, committed to the soul to the mission of the Reich. But that image, meticulously cared for by Joseph Goebbels and the state media, hid a reality of extreme luxury, absolute power, and immense wealth. At the end of his life, his personal fortune included more than a dozen residences and private bunkers, hundreds of pieces of stolen art, millions of marks in unaudited bank accounts, a fleet of luxury vehicles and trains, jewels, furniture, porcelain relics, and historical documents. All this while millions of Germans lived in the hardship of war, the battlefields, or the rubble of bombed cities. Adolf Hitler built his personal empire not with productive effort, nor with family inheritance, but with hatred, propaganda, fear, and looting. He used the state as his checking account, companies as his patrons, and war as his great plunder. His fortune was the synthesis of absolute totalitarianism. When the state and the individual merge, everything becomes the property of the dictator. While the German people were called to resist, to give their children their food and their blood for the homeland, The Führer lived surrounded by luxury, power, and secrets. In his death, his hidden empire was also extinguished, although his riches, as his legacy, left a shadow that still darkens the history of Europe. During the darkest years of the Second World War, while the German army devastated cities and destroyed entire countries, another type of conquest, quieter but equally devastating, was carried out in parallel: the cultural plunder of Europe. Behind the battles, thousands of masterpieces, paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, tapestries, and historical objects of incalculable value were systematically stolen by direct order of Adolf Hitler and his trusted men. This gigantic plunder was part of a calculated strategy not only to humiliate the conquered nations, but also to feed the Führer's insatiable appetite for aesthetic grandeur. Hitler, who in his youth dreamed of being an artist, had a deep fascination for classical European art, the Italian Renaissance, the Flemish masters, Greek sculpture, monumental architecture. That personal frustration for not having been accepted into the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna seemed to transform, decades later, into a sick mission to gather under his domain the greatest artistic treasure ever seen. From the first months of occupation in France, Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, and the Soviet Union, special commands, such as the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, were deployed exclusively to confiscate private collections, empty national galleries, and seize entire libraries. These units acted with blacklists in hand, directly targeting Europe's most valuable works. Museums such as the Louvre in Paris, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, or the National Museum of Warsaw saw their rooms stripped. At the same time, private collections of Jewish families, many of them with centuries of history, were completely erased. The Rothschilds, the Gutstickers, the Schlosses, the Lindens, thousands of paintings, clocks, illuminated manuscripts, and ritual objects disappeared behind the doors of the Nazi plunder. The works were not only taken as loot, they were carefully selected. Those that Hitler considered worthy were sent to secret storage sites or destined for his private residences and those of the High Command. The rest, considered degenerate art, cubism, expressionism, Dadaism, were sold on the black market or simply destroyed. The symbolic epicenter of this plunder had a name: the Führer Museum, the personal museum that Hitler planned to build in Linz, his birthplace in Austria. His ambition was clear: to create the largest museum in the world, a temple to Western art that would overshadow the Louvre, the Prado, and the Hermitage. The regime's architects, led by Albert Speer, began the first designs in 1939. The plans called for large marble halls, corridors with neoclassical columns, monumental fountains, and a collection without parallel. Hitler himself, in private, spent hours reviewing catalogues of looted art, personally selecting which works would be in his museum: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, Caravaggio, Dürer, Raphael. Although this ambitious project never came to fruition, and the plans were buried with the collapse of the Reich, its existence served as an ideological and political justification for the organized plunder of the most important collections on the continent. Unlike many dictators who resort to shell companies, figureheads, or tax havens, Adolf Hitler did not need to hide his income. His position as absolute leader of the Third Reich allowed him to take whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. He was accountable to no fiscal or legal body. He was the law. If he wanted an estate, it was enough to expropriate it. If he wanted a work of art, it was confiscated. If he needed funds, the central bank transferred them without objection. The Reich functioned like a perfect machine in the service of a single man. Hitler could order the transfer of gold bars from a state vault to an account controlled by his circle. He could arrange for trains loaded with art or jewels to be moved without leaving a documentary trace. The plunder had been institutionalized. Power and property had merged in his person. And in that context, he amassed a monstrous fortune: millions of marks in cash, luxurious properties, hundreds of masterpieces, royal jewels, historical documents, and even rare coins dating from the Roman Empire. When Berlin fell in April of 1945 and Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, the Reich collapsed along with him. His personal empire, buildings, collections, accounts and goods, entered a state of limbo and disintegration. The Allied troops, especially the Soviet and American ones, were the first to enter his residences and storage sites. What they found was a mixture of artistic treasures, secret documents, and luxury objects carefully stored. In the mine tunnels in Austria and Germany, thousands of paintings wrapped in canvases, packed sculptures, folders with manuscripts, gold coins, maps, period furniture, and porcelain appeared. Many of these objects were recovered and returned with greater or lesser success to their legitimate owners. Others remained under Allied custody or were distributed among museums and governments. The bank accounts associated with the Nazi Party and Hitler were closed and their funds frozen. The gold of the Reichsbank, hidden in underground vaults and transported in armored trains, was partially recovered, although more than 200 tons were never found. Despite recovery efforts, a significant portion of Hitler's and his high command's fortune was never located. During the last days of the Reich, documents were burned, train routes were diverted, and secret shipments disappeared into the forests and mountains of Bavaria and Austria. Numerous testimonies suggest that part of this wealth was buried in alpine shelters, hidden in monasteries, transferred to accounts in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or South America, or handed over to collaborators who escaped with new identities. Some treasure hunters still search the Austrian Alps for the mythical Hitler's gold, a legend that, to this day, has neither been fully confirmed nor entirely denied. While asking the German people to offer their blood, their work, and their lives for the glory of the Reich, Hitler enjoyed an existence surrounded by unheard-of privileges. He preached the idea of national sacrifice, of duty, of the just war, while amassing wealth built on misery, fear, and death. His fortune was the result of 4 inseparable pillars: propaganda, which sold millions of copies of Mein Kampf with public funds; institutionalized corruption, which allowed him to loot the state without limits; the support of big capital, which financed him in exchange for power and contracts; the massive plunder of Europe, which turned the Führer into one of the greatest art thieves in modern history. The history of Hitler's fortune is more than a footnote in history books. It is a dark mirror that reveals how absolute power turns the state into private property, how ideology can serve as an excuse for the most shameless theft, and how the economic crimes of Nazism were as colossal as its war crimes. After the dictator's death, many of his riches vanished like his empire. But his legacy and his boundless greed remains a reminder of what happens when excessive ambition is disguised as patriotism and national salvation. Where did Hitler's money come from? It is often thought that Adolf Hitler conquered Germany solely with his charisma, his passionate speeches, and mass mobilization. But behind the rise of the Third Reich, there was something much more tangible and less ideological: money, a powerful and strategic financing network that from the shadows fed the Nazi machine until it became the monster that would devastate Europe. And that money did not come only from the Nazi Party or the German state, but from the greatest fortunes and industries in the country. This is the story of the capital that fueled hatred, power, and war, and of the companies that decided to bet on Hitler. In the 1920s, Germany was a bleeding country. The humiliation imposed by the Treaty of Versailles had left deep wounds. War reparations were suffocating the economy. Inflation reached absurd levels, with bills losing their value in a matter of hours, and the impoverished middle class was sinking into hopelessness. Social misery, unemployment, and the growing threat of Soviet communism created a climate of chaos and uncertainty. In that fertile ground for radicalization emerged Adolf Hitler, a former Austro-Hungarian soldier turned political agitator who promised to restore the lost national pride. But Hitler, at that time, was a man without resources. The Nazi Party in its early years could barely afford its propaganda pamphlets or rent small halls for its meetings. The organization operated thanks to the devotion of a few followers and the scarce private donations of ultra-nationalist sympathizers. In his darkest days, Hitler came to depend on individual contributions for food, lodging, and travel. His power was, in essence, symbolic and limited to small circles. Everything changed with the failed Munich putsch in 1923. The attempted coup was a military disaster but a propaganda success. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison in Landsberg. During his confinement, he understood that the conquest of power would not come through direct violence, but through the system itself. He momentarily abandoned street insurrection and embraced the electoral path. But to carry out that transformation, he needed more than ideological fervor. He needed capital. Capital to expand his message, finance campaigns, print propaganda, buy loyalties, and compete politically in a still democratic system. It was in prison that he began to build his new image. He dictated Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess, a book that mixed autobiography, racism, geopolitics, and extreme nationalism. At first, the book had little success, but when Hitler came to power in 1933, Mein Kampf became one of the regime's most effective propaganda instruments. It became required reading in schools, universities, and state offices. It was given to newlyweds, soldiers, officials, and students. The royalties from copyright began to pour in. In just a few years, Hitler became a millionaire. He had not only triumphed politically, but now had a permanent and secure source of personal income. That publishing success was only the beginning. The true Nazi financing machine began to operate in the mid-1920s and accelerated sharply in the 30s. The National Socialist Party stopped looking only for ideological sympathizers and began courting the German industrial elite. Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and above all Hermann Göring were key figures in these efforts. They promised something very attractive to big business: order, social control, and a break on communism. The Red Threat was real. The German Communist Party, KPD, was gaining strength in the streets and at the polls. Strikes paralyzed factories. Unions organized increasingly radical demonstrations. In this context, Hitler was perceived by many businessmen as a sort of lesser evil, an extremist who, however, would guarantee the survival of the capitalist system, sweep away the left, and secure public contracts. His anti-socialist rhetoric became a direct bridge to the offices of the great industries. The definitive opportunity came in January of 1932. Hitler was invited to speak before the Düsseldorf Club, an exclusive circle that brought together the country's greatest fortunes: bankers, industrialists, merchants, and owners of the largest economic conglomerates of interwar Germany. Representatives of Krupp, Siemens, IG Farben, BASF, Thyssen, and Deutsche Bank were present there. Hitler understood that he could not present himself as the firebrand who agitated crowds, so he softened his speech. He spoke of stability, of national reconstruction, of respect for private property, and of a crusade against Marxism. He assured that his party would not attack the traditional economic structure, that there would be no expropriations nor collectivization. He promised instead a new order where capital and the state would work together for the greatness of Germany. The message was clear. Hitler offered the economic elites protection, expansion, and social control. In exchange, he asked for resources, and he obtained them. From that moment on, substantial donations flowed from the country's main companies into the coffers of the Nazi Party. Some did it out of nationalist conviction, others out of pure pragmatism. The truth is that in the following months, Nazi campaigns gained unprecedented momentum. Rallies, posters, newspapers, uniforms, and vehicles multiplied. Nazi propaganda flooded Germany. Hitler became an omnipresent figure, and his party became a formidable electoral force. When he was finally appointed Chancellor in January of 1933, many of those companies were rewarded with contracts, licenses, tax exemptions, and privileged access to the state. The relationship between the Nazi regime and big capital was neither accidental nor incidental. It was a conscious alliance. Industries such as IG Farben manufactured everything from synthetic gasoline to Zyklon B gas. Companies such as Krupp and Siemens thrived on the war economy and slave labor. The machinery of the Third Reich could not have moved without the gears of private finance. In short, behind the symbols, speeches, and flags, there were checks, boards of directors, and closed-door meetings. Hitler did not conquer Germany with words alone. He also did it with money, the money of the powerful, of those who preferred to feed the monster rather than lose their privileges. This is not only a story of ideology, but also of calculation, complicity, and ambition. Because the war that devastated the world was financed in large part from marble offices and boardrooms, and those who bet on Hitler not only bought influence, they bought catastrophe. The economic elite left convinced Hitler was a necessary evil but a useful one. He was not a refined man nor a traditional statesman, but he embodied something that the great businessmen believed they had lost with the Weimar Republic: order, authority, discipline. They saw him as a wall against political chaos, against workers' strikes, against the growing communism that threatened to devour their industrial empires. It was in a meeting held in February of 1933 at the official residence of the President of the Reichstag, where Hitler, already Chancellor, presented himself before a select group of industrialists. There he did not promise freedom or democracy, but stability, repression against unions, protection of private property, and an ambitious rearmament plan. They left convinced. From that moment on, donations began to flow like never before. In the following months, especially during the electoral campaign of 1932 and 1933, the Nazi Party received millions of marks in private contributions. What had begun as a marginal movement, sustained with personal funds and small collections, became a political machine driven by the largest fortunes in Germany. And it was not for ideology, it was for calculation. Those who financed the Nazi rise were not idealists, they were businessmen. Several companies became financial pillars of the regime. IG Farben, the giant of the chemical industry, was one of the main sponsors. In the following years, it would not only benefit from state contracts for the production of synthetic rubber and fuels, but it would also manufacture Zyklon B gas, used to murder millions of people in extermination camps. Science and crime merged into the same production chain. Krupp, the historic armaments empire led by Gustav Krupp, supported the regime from the beginning with the hope of reactivating the military industry, then limited by the Treaty of Versailles. It was a safe bet. In a few years, Krupp's factories would be back to full capacity, forging cannons, armor, and vehicles that would traverse Europe in the name of war. Fritz Thyssen, the steel magnate, was one of the first to see in Hitler a useful instrument. As early as the late 1920s, Thyssen contributed significant sums to the Nazi movement, convinced that the party's political violence was an effective antidote against the expansion of Marxism. Although he would later regret it and break with the regime, his initial support was crucial. Daimler-Benz, for its part, contributed generous funds, expecting in return state contracts to produce military vehicles. The war became the best business. Mercedes-Benz would be, during the conflict, one of the main suppliers of the Third Reich. Technological companies such as Siemens and Telefunken also joined the effort. Their role was less visible but equally vital. Telecommunications, radar, control systems, an architecture of surveillance and communication that sustained the military expansion and internal control of the regime. Even the banks played a central role. Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank not only facilitated loans but actively participated in money laundering, in channeling funds to accounts linked to the party, and in the absorption of expropriated Jewish companies. The Reich's financial machinery needed banks willing to turn a blind eye, and it found them. These donations and collaborations were not altruistic gestures, nor were they, in most cases, ideological commitments. They were investments. In return, the businessmen expected political favors, public contracts, protection of their businesses, tax reductions, and a controlled working class stripped of union rights and subjected to the discipline of the state. Nazism promised order, and capital demanded obedience. Once Hitler assumed the position of Chancellor in January of 1933, he also began to consolidate his personal economic power. Under the direction of the party's treasurer, Franz Xaver Schwarz, a fundraising mechanism was created known as the Adolf Hitler Fund, also called the Führer's Honor Fund. Officially, it was about voluntary donations from the country's most important companies to the leader of the Reich. In practice, it was an unwritten obligation. Refusing to contribute could mean reprisals, loss of contracts, or accusations of disloyalty to the regime. Fear was also a financial tool. Millions of marks flowed each year into this fund, an account that escaped any fiscal control and that was used both for political activities and for Hitler's personal use. From there came the funds for the expansion of the Berghof residence, the acquisition of works of art, the construction of vacation homes, the purchase of luxury vehicles, and rewards for loyal officials. Hitler had no salary as head of state, but he did not need one. The Führer was supported by the country's business elite, like a modern emperor whose throne was paid for with dividends. With Germany's rearmament starting in 1935, the regime became the country's largest buyer of industrial goods. Spending on infrastructure, such as the Reich's highways, on armaments, technology, and logistics generated unprecedented economic prosperity for those on the right side of power. The companies that had financed the Nazi rise were the first to receive multi-million mark contracts. They were commissioned to build tanks, produce steel, manufacture airplanes, refine synthetic fuels, develop radar systems, and produce millions of uniforms, boots, electronic components, and weapons. In exchange for these benefits, many of these companies also agreed to use slave labor. With the expansion of the concentration camp and labor camp system, the use of prisoners as free labor was enabled. Private companies established factories in the camps themselves or near them, using the inmates as workers to the point of exhaustion, without pay, without rights, without dignity. It was the most savage capitalism, legitimized by the most brutal state in modern history. For years, many of these corporations hid their role in financing Nazism and their participation in the regime's crimes. After the defeat in 1945, some were investigated and their executives tried in the so-called Nuremberg trials for industrialists. There were convictions, yes, but there was also leniency. Most received light sentences or were acquitted. With the arrival of the Cold War, the interest in punishing the economic collaborators of Nazism quickly faded. The priority was to rebuild Europe and stop the advance of communism. In that new scenario, the old allies of the Third Reich once again came to be seen as strategic partners. Little by little, their names began to shine again in the business world. The brands survived, some merged, others changed their face. But the history was filed away, silenced. Only decades later, when historical memory became an ethical demand, did documents, evidence, and confessions begin to come to light. Some companies apologized, others still remain silent. Adolf Hitler would not have come to power without the determined support of the great German industrialists. His rise was not solely the product of mass fanaticism, incendiary rhetoric, or the institutional collapse of the Republic. It was also the result of a deliberate alliance between political violence and economic power. It was a pact: blood for gold, order for silence, totalitarianism for profit. While Hitler spoke of blood, of land, of national pride, his true weapons were not in the speeches. They were in the steel factories, in the silent banks, in the contracts without moral clauses. The money that sustained his rise, his propaganda, and his war did not come from the people. It came from the marble halls, from the executives' offices, from the bank statements. It was unscrupulous capitalism, fear of communism, and boundless ambition that opened the door to the monster. And when that monster entered, no one could stop him. The personal fortunes of Adolf Hitler. When the Third Reich rose over the ruins of the Weimar Republic, Adolf Hitler promised the German people a new era of greatness, pride, and austerity. With a firm voice, he spoke of sacrifice, of discipline, and of the need to renounce bourgeois pleasures for the good of the nation. However, while millions of Germans suffered rationing, unemployment, or died on the battlefronts, the Führer lived like a monarch hidden behind the veil of propaganda. Behind the image of a selfless leader, Hitler amassed a personal fortune valued at hundreds of millions of marks, thanks to a system of legalized corruption, political favors, war plunder, and the conversion of the state into his petty cash fund. His personal empire encompassed luxurious properties, a fleet of exclusive vehicles, protected bank accounts, and even a collection of stolen art. It all began with Mein Kampf, the political manifesto that Hitler wrote in prison after the failed coup d'etat in 1923. What began as a marginal pamphlet became, under the Nazi propaganda machine, a compulsory book for officials, soldiers, and even newlywed couples. The state bought millions of copies with public funds. From this concept alone, Hitler earned between 7 and 12 million marks, a colossal figure for the time. Aware of his growing wealth, Hitler ordered the tax authorities to declare him exempt from taxes. He did not pay a single mark in taxes on his income from 1934 until his death in 1945. Thus, his fortune accumulated clean and without control. Residences of the Führer, palaces disguised as austerity, the Berghof, Obersalzberg, Bavaria. The jewel of his personal empire was the Berghof, a vast mansion located high in the Bavarian Alps. Originally a modest vacation home, it was transformed between 1935 and 1936 into a palatial residence with large terraces, gardens, a glass lookout, and a private cinema. All was financed with money from the state and the Nazi Party. From here, Hitler governed for long periods, received foreign dignitaries, and rested far from the bustle of Berlin. It is estimated that the remodeling and maintenance of the Berghof cost more than 30 million marks. Reich Chancellery, Berlin. Although it was an official residence, Hitler had it adapted to his taste. The new Reich Chancellery, designed by Albert Speer, had marble corridors more than 140 meters long, monumental halls, and decorative luxuries that evoked Roman imperial power. Hitler lived there like in a modern castle. Each carpet, each chandelier, each bronze bust was hand-picked or brought from private collections. Apartment on Prinzregentenplatz, Munich. A more intimate residence decorated with classic furniture, oriental rugs, fine porcelain, and a personal library. He had lived there since the 1920s, and it was used even after his rise to power as a place for private meetings. Hidden residences, in addition to the Berghof and the Chancellery, Hitler had access to other secret retreats. The Kehlstein House, or Eagle's Nest, built as a gift for his 50th birthday, and bunkers camouflaged in East Prussia and Vienna. Although officially state properties, in practice they responded to the Führer's whims. Hitler did not drive, but he had a weakness for luxury cars. His most famous personal vehicle was the Mercedes-Benz 770K Grosser, an armored limousine with a 7.7-liter engine capable of reaching 160 kilometers per hour. He had several of these units, customized with bulletproof protection, convertible roofs, and Third Reich emblems. In addition, his fleet included Audi Hawk 951A, used in military parades, Maybach Zeppelin DS-8, a high-end vehicle reserved for special occasions, Mercedes-Benz G4W31, a luxury off-road vehicle used in visits to occupied territories. These vehicles were not paid for with his salary, but with state funds or donations from automotive companies proud to offer their models to the Führer. Clothing and suits, carefully studied sobriety, Hitler was obsessive about his image. He always appeared dressed in sober-toned uniforms, perfectly pressed without medals or excess, but behind that sobriety was a wardrobe of the highest craftsmanship, tailor-made uniforms from personal tailors, leather boots polished daily by assistants, silk and fine linen loungewear used at the Berghof, an exclusive wardrobe for diplomatic visits and photo sessions. Although he boasted of his simplicity, it is estimated that his complete wardrobe was valued at more than 200,000 marks, a gigantic sum considering the average salaries of the time. Jewels, art, and personal objects. Although Hitler was not a lover of jewels, he accumulated an immense quantity of valuable objects, many of them stolen or gifted. Looted works of art, paintings by Flemish, Italian, and French masters, Renaissance sculptures, Baroque furniture, medieval tapestries, pieces of Meissen porcelain, wrought silver and Bohemian crystal, diplomatic gifts of incalculable value such as jade vases, ceremonial swords, decorated pistols, gold watches, historical documents, rare books and original manuscripts. Part of this treasure was destined for his frustrated dream, the Führer Museum in Linz. Others adorned his residences or were stored in secret vaults. Hitler had accounts in Reichsbank. His personal account was shielded and without audits. Swiss and Austrian banks, used for hidden transfers and Nazi party funds. A part of his money was handled in cash by his close circle, especially Martin Bormann, who controlled the Führer's expenses like a financial butler. There is no exact figure, but historians such as Hans Mommsen and Ian Kershaw estimate that Hitler's personal fortune at the time of his death was around 1.1 billion Reichsmarks, including goods, properties, royalties, donations, and undeclared accounts. Translated into modern currency, it would be the equivalent of hundreds of millions of euros or dollars. When Hitler committed suicide in the Berlin bunker on the 30th of April of 1945, his political testament ordered that all his assets be returned to the German state. However, many of his possessions were looted by Soviet soldiers, confiscated by the Allies, or mysteriously disappeared. The bank accounts were closed, the art was dispersed or destroyed, and some pieces ended up in museums or private collections. The Berghof was bombed and later demolished by the Bavarian government. Of his fortune, very little remained officially documented. Hitler preached austerity while enjoying luxury. His fortune was the result of a corrupt apparatus, of an unlimited cult of personality, and of a system where the state and the party merged to serve his will. He lived surrounded by wealth while asking Germans for blood and sacrifice. And although the Reich fell, his personal empire left an indelible mark of how absolute power and ambition can corrupt even the most intimate core of the individual. What happened to Hitler's money after the war? When Adolf Hitler died in April of 1945 in the Chancellery bunker in Berlin, he left behind not only a country in ruins and millions of dead, but also a secret personal fortune valued at more than 700 million German marks, which today would be equivalent to more than $5,000 million. But this immense capital did not come out of nowhere. What is truly disturbing is that the man who ended his days surrounded by riches had begun his adult life begging for shelter and food, selling postcards in the streets of Vienna with nothing more than a portfolio of watercolors. Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April of 1889 in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, the son of Alois Hitler, a customs official, and Clara Pölzl, a devoted mother. The family enjoyed a modest existence within the provincial middle class. From a young age, Adolf expressed a deep interest in art, especially painting and architecture, which clashed with his father's more conventional aspirations for him to have a stable career as a bureaucrat. After the death of his parents, Hitler moved to Vienna with the hope of entering the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts, but his dream collapsed in 1907 when he was rejected for a second time, partly due to his lack of skill in anatomical drawing. That rejection was a turning point. Without formal education, without employment, and with an orphan's pension of barely 25 crowns, Hitler quickly fell into destitution. He spent years living in homeless shelters such as the Menneheim on Meldemannstrasse, sharing space with alcoholics, the unemployed, and social outcasts. He survived by selling hand-painted postcards, shoveling snow, or carrying luggage at train stations. Many days he did not earn enough even to eat. It was during those years that he began to read intensively, especially anti-Semitic pamphlets, ultra-nationalist newspapers, and racial theories. The bitterness of his poverty mixed with a growing political resentment. In 1913, Hitler received a small inheritance of 820 crowns from his deceased father. That money was enough to escape Viennese misery and move to Munich, Germany, where he hoped to restart his life as an artist. What he found there was the outbreak of the First World War, in which he enlisted with enthusiasm, serving as a messenger on the Western Front. He was wounded, decorated, and after the conflict he felt that his life had acquired a new purpose: to save Germany. In November of 1923, after years of political agitation, Hitler attempted a coup d'état in Munich, known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The attempt failed and he was arrested, but instead of ending his career, his time in prison became an unexpected opportunity. During the 9 months he spent in Landsberg prison, Hitler dictated to his secretary Rudolf Hess what would become his political and ideological manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Published in 1925 by the Franz Eyre Nachfolger publishing house, directed by Max Amann, an old comrade of his and future treasurer of the Nazi Party. The book mixed autobiography, geopolitical vision, racism, and nationalism. The first volume was received coldly. Bookstores could not sell it, critics ridiculed it, and it seemed it would be just another publishing failure. In 1929, the Wall Street crash dragged the world into a global depression. Germany, battered by inflation, war debts, and rampant unemployment, fell into desperation. In that climate of social distress, radical solutions began to gain ground. Hitler's extremist ideas, which once seemed marginal, became attractive to millions. From 1930 onward, sales of Mein Kampf began to grow. Each election that brought the Nazi Party closer to power increased the demand for the book. The rallies, loaded with propaganda, worked as promotional presentations. Hitler's figure was no longer that of an agitator. He had become a symbol of national redemption. When he was finally appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, the Nazi publishing house turned Mein Kampf into a compulsory consumer product. It was given free to newlyweds, read in schools, and public officials were practically obliged to own a copy. The book became omnipresent. With each copy sold, more than 12 million before 1945, Hitler received direct royalties, becoming one of the most lucrative authors in German history. Hitler's political rise not only gave him power, but also direct access to state funds. As Führer, he no longer needed to disguise his economic interests. He paid no taxes, had no accountability, and was under no financial oversight. The Nazi Party, through Amann and other collaborators, managed his properties, royalties, donations, and gifts from German businessmen. In addition, Hitler lived surrounded by luxuries. The mountain residence in Berghof, decorated with stolen works, a fleet of luxury automobiles, private trains, fine porcelain tableware, tailored suits, and a team of personal assistants. Everything was paid for with state money or donations from magnates seeking favors from the regime. By the end of the war, Hitler had accumulated a fortune estimated at more than 700 million Reichsmarks, a figure that does not include looted goods, confiscated properties, or jewels hidden by his circle. But his personal empire, like the Reich, collapsed in April of 1945. After his suicide in the bunker, the Allies discovered hidden deposits containing gold coins, works of art, luxury furniture, jewels, and documents. Part of his bank accounts was frozen, but a considerable portion of his fortune disappeared without a trace. Some believe it was transferred to Switzerland, others that it was buried in the Alps, and there are those who claim it was sent to Argentina and South America by collaborators who escaped in the final days of the war. The contrast between the homeless youth who sold postcards for coins and the dictator who amassed an imperial fortune at the expense of human suffering holds a macabre irony. Hitler preached sacrifice to the German people while living in opulence. He demanded rations while eating from silver tableware. He had been poor, yes, but once in power he never looked back. His hunger for wealth, born in the shelters of Vienna, was finally satisfied. But not with talent, nor with work, with blood, looting, and absolute power. And although his regime was destroyed, the history of his fortune and its disappearance remains a mystery as disturbing as his political legacy. By the time Adolf Hitler assumed power in Germany in 1933, he was no longer simply a radical politician. He had become an immensely rich man. That same year, the sales of his autobiographical and propagandistic book reached the astonishing figure of 1,500,000 copies annually. Between 1925 and that year, the income accumulated from the royalties of Mein Kampf had surpassed 1,200,000 Reichsmarks, a sum so considerable that it guaranteed his financial stability for life. The book, which in its first years had gone almost unnoticed, began to climb in the sales rankings when the Nazi Party gained strength. And with Hitler's rise to the chancellorship, it became not only a political work, but also a symbol of the new order. But the income was not limited to the German market. Mein Kampf was translated into more than 16 languages, including English, French, Italian, and others. Despite the growing political tensions in Europe, publishers in countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom continued paying generous royalties and advances for the publishing rights. Some of these transactions were carried out even as the international community began to view with concern the advance of the Nazi regime. By the start of the Second World War in 1939, the total sales of the book had already surpassed 5 million copies. During the war years, the book was even more actively promoted by the Nazi propaganda apparatus. It was distributed free of charge among soldiers, workers, newlywed couples, and party officials. The intention was clear: to ensure that every citizen of the Reich knew, embraced, and propagated the Führer's vision. At the time of his death in 1945, it is estimated that more than 12 million copies had been distributed or sold in Germany and the occupied territories. Ironically, what began as a publishing failure ended up becoming a money-making machine. The book not only conveyed his ideology, it also gave Hitler the financial means to expand it on a continental scale. However, that unexpected commercial success brought with it a consequence that Hitler had no intention of accepting: taxes. Already in 1932, when his income from royalties and speaking fees had reached substantial figures, Hitler had not filed a single tax return. He simply ignored tax obligations as if they did not apply to him. Although his growing fortune was no secret, the tax authorities had not acted forcefully. Only in 1933, when the Nazi Party came to power, did the Munich tax office decide to open an investigation. The result was conclusive. At the start of 1934, officials calculated a tax debt amounting to 405,494 Reichsmarks, which today would be equivalent to more than $1.5 million. The figure included years of evasion plus accumulated fines. The response of the new Chancellor of the Reich was simple and authoritarian. Instead of paying, he directly ordered the Ministry of Finance to declare him exempt from all tax obligations. A state secretary acted as intermediary, and shortly afterward, the head of the Munich tax office issued a formal statement declaring that any report implying a tax debt for the Führer was null from the start. In practical terms, Hitler was officially declared free from paying taxes. While thousands of ordinary Germans were persecuted, fined, or even imprisoned for minor infractions against the tax authorities, he simply erased his debt with a signature. The implications were profound. From that moment on, all of Hitler's income, from Mein Kampf royalties, his salary as head of state, special payments, donations from businessmen and allied parties, and fees for his speeches, was completely tax-free. In practice, his fortune immediately increased by approximately 40%, the standard tax rate for high-income individuals in Germany. This tax exemption became one of the cornerstones of his personal wealth. It was not only about greed, but also about a mechanism of total control. Hitler not only dominated German politics, he had also legally placed himself above the system that governed the rest of his compatriots. With a constant inflow of millions of marks without any deductions, he began to build a luxury empire. One of his first major investments was the acquisition and renovation of a country house in the Bavarian Alps, which he had purchased in 1928, long before his rise to power. That modest retreat was transformed using Nazi party funds into an extensive and lavish property known as the Berghof. With panoramic views, marble halls, large dining rooms, a personal library, a private cinema, and guest rooms, the Berghof became the dictator's favorite residence, a place where he combined contemplative retreat with strategic meetings. But that Alpine estate was not the pinnacle of his extravagance. For his 50th birthday in 1939, the Nazi state apparatus gave him a monumental construction, the Kelstein House, popularly known as the Eagle's Nest. Located on the summit of a steep mountain at more than 1,800 meters of altitude, it could only be reached via an elevator hidden inside the rock. Although officially presented as a government facility for official receptions, in reality it functioned as a sanctuary for his personal cult, a sort of alpine throne from which Hitler looked out at the world like a modern emperor. With each political decision, each propaganda campaign, and each step toward war, Hitler not only consolidated his absolute power, but also fed and expanded his fortune. While the common citizen gave up possessions for the cause, rationed food, and suffered the deprivations of conflict, the dictator lived surrounded by stolen art, luxury furniture, confiscated jewels, and well-trained servants. In a country devastated by the war effort, he was a monarch shielded by wealth, impunity, and fear. Long before Adolf Hitler reached power, he had known hunger and misery firsthand. After the death of his parents and his failure as an artist in Vienna, he lived for several years in conditions of extreme poverty, sleeping in municipal shelters and surviving on cheap soup and hard bread. That lonely and resentful young man who wandered the streets with a folder of drawings under his arm would years later accumulate one of the darkest and largest fortunes of the 20th century. Hitler's rise in political life brought with it not only absolute power but also unlimited access to wealth. Money began to flow even before he reached the chancellery, thanks to the sale of his book Mein Kampf. From 1933 onward, the work became a mandatory indoctrination tool. Its sales grew exponentially, and it was soon distributed en masse at party events, civil weddings, military barracks, and schools. From the royalties of the book alone, Hitler amassed an amount that easily exceeded 1 million Reichsmarks, which increased each month thanks to the wide national and international circulation of the work. But that financial flow did not end with publishing sales. It was joined by fees for speeches, donations from industrial business circles, payments from the state, and image rights. Hitler, unlike other political leaders, never distinguished between his personal assets and the funds of the Nazi Party. he considered both as extensions of his will. The money that entered the NSDAP, whether voluntary contributions or state budgets disguised as administrative expenses, was redirected to his own interests with total impunity. One of the pillars of his wealth was consolidated thanks to systematic and deliberate tax evasion. For years, Hitler avoided declaring his income, accumulating a 1 million mark debt with the Munich tax office. But upon becoming head of government, he simply ordered the tax authorities to exempt him from any tax obligation. The Ministry of Finance officially declared him tax-free. It was both a symbolic and practical act of his absolute power. While the German people struggled to survive amid the crisis, he became an untouchable millionaire. With that base of tax-free income and a constant flow of illicit or embezzled funds, Hitler began a transformation of his personal life. He bought a modest country house in the Bavarian Alps in 1928, long before taking power. But after becoming Chancellor, that property was expanded with excessive luxuries. Named the Berghof, it became a luxurious mountain residence. There, surrounded by forests and mountains, he lived like a modern monarch. Rooms decorated with looted art, large panoramic windows, exclusive furnishings, well-trained staff, and permanent security. Art became his next obsession. With the outbreak of the war and the territorial expansion of the Third Reich, Hitler took advantage of the occupation of Europe to deploy a network of art looters. Special teams operated in Paris, Warsaw, Brussels, and other cities with the sole purpose of identifying, seizing, or purchasing under coercion masterpieces from museums and private collections. Jewish families in particular were forced to hand over paintings, sculptures, and antiques for symbolic sums, or were simply stripped of everything. A large part of these works was destined for the Führer's ambitious project, the Führer Museum in Linz, Austria, his hometown. Although the museum was never built, it served as a justification for the systematic theft of Europe's cultural heritage. The pieces were not only stored for posterity, but also decorated his residences and offices. Thus, the stolen art became an extension of his fortune, a mixture of personal whim, visual propaganda, and imperial ambition. In addition to art, Hitler invested in luxury vehicles. He ordered special Mercedes-Benz limousines, reinforced with armor and unique security features. They were not simple automobiles. They were mobile showcases of Nazi power, symbols of authority wrapped in steel and chrome. These limousines, which were often accompanied by escorts and parades, were part of the carefully constructed image of an invincible Führer. The German industrial apparatus was also key in financing his personal fortune. Steel and armament magnates such as Fritz Thyssen and Gustav Krupp channeled large sums of money to the Nazi Party in exchange for contracts, political favors, and tax benefits. Those funds, although officially entering the party, often ended up financing Hitler's private luxuries. His personal train, his residences, his team of cooks, assistants, gardeners, and bodyguards were maintained not by official allocations, but by those parallel funds. As the war progressed and the Reich's economy headed toward collapse, Hitler became concerned about the security of his assets. German financial institutions no longer offered sufficient protection. That was when Switzerland, with its legendary banking secrecy and guaranteed neutrality, became the ideal destination to safeguard part of his fortune. It is suspected that various sums were discreetly transferred to Swiss accounts, some registered under the names of trusted collaborators. However, after the fall of the Third Reich, many of these records disappeared or were destroyed. To this day, the details about the exact magnitude of the assets hidden in Swiss banks remain shrouded in mystery. The management of these complex finances was in the hands of Max Amann, a former comrade-in-arms of Hitler during the First World War and director of the Nazi publishing empire. Amann oversaw income from multiple sources. Book sales, image rights, fees, state contributions, and corporate donations. The flow of money had to remain constant but also hidden. It was a system carefully designed to sustain an emperor-level lifestyle in the midst of a nation at war. The royalties from Mein Kampf, even during the conflict, continued generating enormous profits. Foreign publishers, especially British and American, kept sending payments until their respective governments intervened. In the case of the United States, it was necessary to apply the Trading with the Enemy Act to finally seize more than $250,000 in royalties that continued to flow through legal channels. But by then, a considerable portion of that money had already been transferred or spent. Thus, while millions of Europeans suffered under occupation, hunger, bombings, and persecution, Hitler lived as an absolute sovereign, surrounded by art, luxury, obedience, and ill-gotten wealth. He did not build his empire through work or inheritance, but through manipulation, propaganda, plunder, and absolute impunity. What began with a book written in a cell ended as a fortune built on the suffering of millions. During the war years, Adolf Hitler not only accumulated political and military power, he also deliberately built a hidden, complex, and carefully diversified financial empire. While his fortune had begun with direct income from his book Mein Kampf, donations from industrialists, and the almost total control of Nazi party funds, Hitler went further. He began to turn liquid money into lasting, hard-to-trace assets. He bought strategic real estate in different regions of the Reich, not only as residences but also as stores of value. He acquired properties in Berlin, Munich, and Bavaria, in addition to his famous mountain retreat in Obersalzberg. At the same time, he stored enormous quantities of stolen art, much of it in underground bunkers and secret warehouses protected from bombings. These works, mostly plundered from Jewish collectors or taken from museums during the occupation of Europe, were destined for a museum that would never come to light, the so-called Führer Museum in Linz. However, beyond their symbolic value, these pieces also served as financial reserves, silent, movable, and extremely valuable investments. Hitler, aware of the volatile nature of war and power, also converted cash into gold, foreign currency, and other transferable assets. This strategy was not driven by greed alone. It was a contingency plan. In the event of military defeat, those assets could guarantee him an escape route, a possible exile, or in the worst-case scenario, the means to resurface from the shadows. For that reason, part of his wealth was sent abroad, especially to neutral countries. Switzerland, with its tradition of banking secrecy, was one of the preferred destinations. It is presumed that many transfers were made through trusted intermediaries or via shell companies, making any later tracing attempts extremely difficult. Not all this wealth was documented. As the Reich began to falter in the final years of the war, there was a systematic destruction of financial records. Many key documents disappeared in the flames of Berlin, and the few people who knew how to handle the accounts, including bankers, SS officers, and high-ranking party officials, either died or simply vanished in the chaos of collapse. Hitler knew that absolute power could vanish in an instant. That is why he had created a financial network capable of surviving his downfall. But that same network, built in secrecy and without legal oversight, proved impossible to track once the Third Reich disintegrated. The plan, if it existed, never materialized. On the 30th of April of 1945, in the basements of the Berlin Chancellery, Hitler took his own life as Soviet troops seized the city. Any attempt to escape, recover his fortune, or regroup disappeared with him. What remained was a poisoned inheritance, hidden accounts, looted works, half-destroyed properties, and a will without a future. In his final document, written shortly before his suicide, Hitler specified that his fortune should be given to the Nazi Party, or, if it no longer existed, to the German state. But both ceased to exist almost immediately. Germany collapsed, was occupied, divided and rebuilt from scratch by foreign powers. Legally, there was no one left who could legitimately claim his estate. In that legal vacuum, the Bavarian government, the region where Hitler had official residence, assumed de facto control of the traceable assets. It did so quietly, without fanfare, while the Allies attempted to rebuild the country and dismantle every trace of the former regime. Through this discreet administration, they ensured that the national royalties from Mein Kampf, which continued to generate considerable income, were redirected toward charitable causes. For decades, the book remained out of circulation in Germany, officially banned and available only to academics with special permits. That changed in 2016, when his copyrights expired and the text entered the public domain. In the meantime, the United States managed to seize an identifiable portion of Hitler's assets. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the American government confiscated more than $250,000 in royalties accumulated by Mein Kampf from American publishers. That money was redirected to refugee aid organizations, one of the few times that the Führer's resources could be repurposed for humanitarian benefit. As for his physical properties, each had a different fate. His apartment in Munich was occupied by the authorities and later repurposed for civilian use. The Berghof, symbol of his Alpine retreat, was bombed by Allied aviation and then demolished for fear it would become a pilgrimage site for sympathizers. Only the Eagle's Nest, a building constructed as a gift from the party for his 50th birthday, survived and was later transformed into a tourist attraction, though stripped of any Nazi symbolism. The looted works of art suffered a fragmented fate. Some were found by Allied forces and returned to their original owners or to national museums. Others never resurfaced, perhaps lost in sealed bunkers, sold on the black market or hidden in private collections. Despite efforts to trace each piece, many remain to this day beyond the reach of historical justice. Even Hitler's personal belongings became fetishes of memory and trophies of the fall of the Third Reich. A globe that decorated his office was auctioned for more than $100,000. His red telephone, from which he issued deadly orders, fetched an even higher price. Ceremonial pistols with ivory grips or gold plating were acquired by collectors for astronomical sums. It was the strange paradox of defeat. The dictator's physical legacy turned into souvenirs of his ruin. Even so, most of his fortune disappeared. It vanished in the smoke of burned archives, collapsed tunnels, missing accounts, and the corrupt hands that took advantage of the chaos to seize what remained. No one has been able to determine with certainty the total value of the capital Hitler amassed. Estimates range between tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, but the truth is that his economic empire, built on plunder, death, and deceit, dissolved as quickly as his regime. In the end, everything he had accumulated was reduced to scattered fragments, relics of a boundless ambition that ended up devouring itself. The man who turned looting into state policy left no heirs nor real economic legacy. Only ruins, burned documents, lost works, and the echo of a story of greed that, like his power, evaporated with the war.